Most people who are fans of video games these days probably still know the name Metal Gear. It's a series that has been discussed as well as memed for decades now. Despite relatively modest sales for most of the series, everyone also knows Hideo Kojima, and they probably closely followed him as he began crafting his first new game away from Konami, Death Stranding. Metal Gear is the series that really popularized the stealth genre, with Metal Gear Solid in particular bringing it to the mainstream. There had been other stealth games before MGS, and they certainly have their place, but Metal Gear Solid is what really got people to care, to recognize its potential as a genre. When I was a young teenager, I used to dislike Metal Gear Solid 1. A trailer for it came with the interactive Sampler Volume 7 demo disc packed with my PlayStation 1, and it showed tons of action, story, and insanely good cinematography for a game at the time. It wasn't until a few years later that I actually got to play a Metal Gear game though, and it left me completely unimpressed. Not because it was a bad game, but instead because I didn't know I wasn't actually playing the game that trailer was showing off. Instead, I was playing Metal Gear Solid VR missions, which is more or less a collection of arcade-style challenges with little in the way of story or cinematography to speak of. You just sort of play a bunch of bite-sized missions that primarily take place in a digital void. I assumed you only got some cutscenes after completing a set of these missions, which felt lazy and misleading, so I never did. It was years until that issue actually got cleared up, and I realized the mistake. At that point, I played MGS 2 and 3 and fell in love, but at the same time, another stealth game had already captured my heart, and it simply wouldn't let go. Some of you might be surprised to know that Splinter Cell wasn't the first heavy-hitting competitor to Metal Gear Solid's stealth empire. In fact, there was one that, at the time, rivaled MGS both in terms of its mechanical depth and complexity, did a decent job capturing its wonderful scene direction, mirrored a lot of its variety and interesting quirks. Oh, and it technically came half a year before Metal Gear Solid would see the light of day. Metal Gear Solid released in September of 1998, around halfway through the lifespan of the PlayStation 1. This mysterious competitor was already lurking in the shadows at that point though, garnering large amounts of praise for its fantastic exploration of stealth mechanics, having released in Japan back in February of the same year. Even the North American release was a month before Metal Gear Solid in August. Tenchu, Stealth Assassins, was a stealth action title that realized the idea of being a ninja in feudal Japan exceptionally well for the time. Tenchu wasn't by any means unpopular either, selling pretty well on the PS1, and again, it gained a fair amount of critical acclaim along the way. So why don't many people remember it, and why don't we see new games in the series anymore? Why doesn't it sit alongside MGS or Splinter Cell, as a series vast swaths of people, young and old, beg to see properly revived in some way? Why was it forgotten, and why has the only brief mention of it in years come from the release of From Software's Sekiro: Shadows Die Twice in 2019? Before we answer these questions, it's probably best if we step back and look at what Tenchu is, how it works, and why it was considered a well-respected peer to MGS at the time, when both games were still fresh. Note that while many of these features are also in the original Tenchu, I'll primarily be discussing Tenchu 2 since it was a more evolved take on the same fundamentals. Tenchu, as previously established, is a stealth action title with an emphasis on variety of choice and freedom. While Metal Gear is broken up into small screens but takes place in a single large base, Tenchu instead swaps out from much larger levels, but each level is their own different mission in a different area. These levels follow an overarching plot, and starting with Tenchu 2, the characters you can choose from can even have their own unique levels along the way, on top of their specific weapons, combat styles, and perspective on the story, which make them stand out from each other. But the player is still largely free to explore these levels from a multitude of angles, giving you a lot of approach options. While Metal Gear also emphasizes firearms, Tenchu has a surprisingly complex melee system for the time. The player only really has one basic combo in Tenchu, sure, but you also have several secondary attacks depending on what buttons you press in conjunction with the attack button. You can do attacks that turn toward your left or right, crouch attacks, an attack that turns your character around, and even a jumping attack. These can be combined with your movement options like crouch walking, rolls, a block, a jump, or even a long jump to give players a plethora of approach options in combat. On top of this, if you catch your enemy off guard, you can do a fancy stealth kill, which offers a surprisingly varied amount of really great animations to go with. Games like Devil May Cry or Kingdom Hearts were still several years away when Tenchu 1 released, and up to this point, most melee combat systems were either ability-based, like you'd see in an action RPG, were confined to one-on-one fighting games, or were stuck to the relative button-mashing antics of a beat-em-up. Most other third-person action titles were not stealth games, nor were they about melee combat. Instead, you primarily relied on guns like in MGS. You can of course still use some long-range options like throwing stars, but most of them are not going to be pinpoint accurate instant kills like a gun. Items extend far beyond just throwing stars though. Firstly, the player always has access to a grappling hook to zip around levels and expand the play space vertically. Beyond this, you can then select up to 4 other item types before the mission starts. These other options range from a healing potion to smoke bombs which confuse enemies, rudimentary grenades, caltrops to drop behind you to deal with pursuers, poison rice to poison enemies, or colored rice to mark the map, blinding powder to get yourself a window to heal, an item that revives you when you die, armor that halves damage inflicted, or even a bone to summon a dog companion to help you in combat. You're given complete freedom to bring whatever combination of items you want, though be warned that they're consumed upon death and don't fill back up to some arbitrary maximum between missions, so you also have to think a bit long-term with them. Items can be found in stages though if you look carefully, and you can sometimes find them on enemy corpses. You'll want to give some thought to when you use items, considering some items like healing potions can be knocked out of your hands by enemies. They can then steal these items for themselves. Speaking of enemies, they're a bit more perceptive than in MGS, but still rely on similar logic. They seem to be able to respond to certain types of sounds, but not everything. They can have fairly long visual cones, but as long as you're not too close, they'll only enter a state of curiosity when they see you, giving you time to escape detection. The key meter tells you how close you are to another living being, but it doesn't let you know whether they're a civilian, or an enemy, or even an animal. And once you're caught, similar to the Soliton radar in MGS, your key radar ceases to function properly. Once killed, enemy bodies can be carried away if necessary to maintain stealth. Environmental factors can also play a part, like fire burning you or your enemies, or being able to hide and explore underwater. Alternative routes can be found if you explore properly, and you can sidle along walls and glance around corners, or hang from ledges to get a better scope on areas ahead before trekking forward. Similar to MGS, Tenchu is really freeform. It feels more organic than something like the first Splinter Cell, which often railroads you with its level design. It's closer to chaos theory in design, though admittedly less intricate. Tenchu 1 and 2 even offer a lot of surprising polishing quirks that make them really smooth to play in certain ways, compared to other games of the time. They're quirks which were extremely rare to find this early in 3D. For example, grapple hook allowances are really large and forgiving, meaning you can actually use it swiftly in a pinch without it being finicky. I can never recall an instance where it latched onto the wrong thing or failed to work properly if my aim and judge of distance wasn't horribly off. Your character always seems to be successful grabbing ledges after a grapple or a jump as well, meaning the system doesn't feel clunky or inconsistent. Collision on surfaces is really forgiving too, meaning jumping up to a ledge or across a large gap isn't so precise as to be frustrating. In Tenchu 1, your character blocks automatically whenever you're backing away from an enemy. In Tenchu 2, they added a dedicated block button, but the original method still works, meaning your reaction times can now be rewarded in 2 different ways. If you're a bit too far away or in an awkward position while trying to initiate a stealth kill, but your weapon still makes contact, it still registers as a stealth kill instead of just damaging the enemy, alerting them, and then forcing you into a dangerous combat encounter. Speaking of, you can even do leaping stealth kills, which when revisiting the games for this video, I never thought would have been offered in a game so old. The series even offers a mission editor that's really comprehensive for the time, to the point that in Japan they actually released a Tenchu title that was literally just 100 fan-made missions to play through. There are several objectives to choose from, tons of objects, and the levels themselves can be a decent size. In so many ways, Tenchu 1 and 2 feel deep, intricate, polished, and incredibly modern for a PlayStation 1 title. They have such potential to be masterclass games from their era that people still avidly play today. So why aren't they well remembered and well-worn games? Well, mechanically, there are really two fatal flaws that stealth kill the PlayStation 1 games before modern players would even think of playing through them. The lack of a lock-on button, and the extremely stiff tank controls for movement. It's not the lack of camera control, nor the usual PlayStation 1 glitchiness that can so often make gameplay from that era unpredictable and difficult. It's not even the questionable performance with frequent slowdown, which was also really common at the time. All three of those issues are manageable in games that are otherwise this good. The problem isn't even technically the use of tank controls and the lack of a lock-on themselves. They can work in many other games. Instead, it's the combination of the two in conjunction with the rest of the design that has an impact on combat. Neither of these choices on their own would kill the game. When you're stealthing around, the tank controls work fine. Clunky, but fine. Once again, enemies aren't much more observant than they are in MGS, making Tenchu much more forgiving than you'd expect for such an early 3D game in a largely unexplored genre. So as long as you're careful, while awkward, the tank controls don't often get in the way during level traversal or stealth. Likewise, if you didn't have the tank controls to deal with, you'd hardly need a lock-on button to get through the combat here the way it's designed. But when you combine the two, it's a recipe for disaster. One of the absolute most common occurrences when in combat in Tenchu is for your attacks to begin moving you forward and clipping you past the enemy, causing you to whiff one of your attacks and leave yourself wide open. When you take a hit, it's also not uncommon for damage you take to turn your character away from the enemy. Even just the enemy readjusting their own position in a way you weren't expecting can cause huge issues. Once you're not facing your enemy, you're at an insane disadvantage. Your block might not work right, because it's not facing the right direction. Even more of your attacks will likely completely whiff. And turning to face your enemy takes so long that they're all but guaranteed to either block your attacks, readjust so that they're in a better position, or get in an attack of their own in the meantime, resetting the problem. And when you're in a tighter arena or up against a wall, the camera gets stuck up against it awkwardly, preventing you from seeing what you need to do to fix your positioning in the first place. This leads to combat that works really well if you do everything well, but it makes staving off death all but a fruitless endeavor as soon as you make a single mistake. It's like you're controlling a puppet on strings. It's really awkward. You can run from enemies, but they're just as fast as you, and the grapple hook, while well designed, is a bit too slow to use as an escape a lot of the time. Same with the quick turn, which is probably your best bet, but even when using the version that attacks while turning, it leaves you vulnerable near the end, so even just regrouping itself is extremely difficult. It's such a shame too, because again, while simple, this combat system is surprisingly rewarding for a PlayStation 1 title, and stealth games always work best when failing to stay hidden affords you a different mode of play that keeps things engaging. It's not fun to suddenly be outgunned with no way to really defend yourself. It's a boring, obvious restart. MGS dealt with this problem by making alerts a game of hide and seek. Tenchu tries to deal with it by forcing you into its intricate combat system, but the combat system can't handle the controls, shattering the experience as soon as you're seen. When such fundamental issues with control are what plague your game, Players who might have heard about it and decided to try it out will quickly get frustrated and move on. Over time, that means fewer and fewer people discuss the series in any positive way, or even understand what its worth was, until eventually it's no longer part of the social consciousness of the medium. Part of the disappearance of Tenchu probably also comes down to the inconsistency of releases, lack of re-releases due to publishing issues, and waning polish over time. Activision was the initial publisher for the series, with Acclaim developing the titles. However, From Software eventually started publishing the series instead, after buying the IP rights in 2004. From Software wasn't an enormous company at the time. They weren't really capable of releasing AAA titles at all, so I don't think they were quite able to give the series the money it needed to flourish and compete with MGS2, 3, or the Splinter Cell series. And Activision still owns the rights to the first 3 titles, meaning From Software can't choose to create remasters with modern controls or anything like that. I suppose they were hoping that wouldn't be necessary because they'd have built up their own catalog of Tenchu titles to manage. Tenchu games like the 3rd and 4th console games, Wrath of Heaven and Fatal Shadows, began to feel a bit behind the times in terms of polish. They were improved over the PS1 titles, but only in certain ways. You now had analog camera control and more traditional 3D movement, but collision and hitbox spacing feels strange, with movement coming across as almost abrupt rather than snappy. Animations were also really unpolished, and while gameplay polish and animation eventually caught back up with the 360 entry Tenchu Z, graphically it was still reminiscent of a PS2 game in HD. Other games like Tenchu Dark Secret or Shadow Assault were overhead arcade-style games, retaining some of the spirit but not evolving the series in any meaningful way. Shadow Assault was basically Hitman Go before Hitman Go, which was more of a lateral movement than a leap forward. This means after Tenchu 2 on the PS1, they never really had a title that felt completely contemporary. It always felt kind of budget. What this really means is that by the time we got the final Tenchu game in 2009, the series was more or less stuck where it had been back in the year 2000, with the release of Tenchu 2. And while its mechanics might have been ahead of their time by a few years in 2000, and they're not even really outdated by today's standards, their implementation could often leave a lot to be desired by the increasing standards of every subsequent year that went by. What these games needed was real, simultaneous polish and expansion, not one or the other. Interestingly, several years ago, From Software talked about the fact that they were working on reviving an old franchise people once loved, which basically meant we had 3 options: Armored Core, Echo Knight, or Tenchu. Considering we've yet to actually see the revival of any old From Software series, I suspect it's entirely possible said resurrection was actually intended to be a Tenchu game. And it's also possible that it was finished, but they didn't have faith in the IP, and instead chose to market it as something brand new: Sekiro: Shadows Die Twice. The core focus on more complex melee combat, ninja items as an alternative to melee, a block that negates 100% of damage inflicted, the grapple hook, freedom and exploration and a focus on verticality in levels, stealth, instant stealth kills, swimming, the initial lack of any multiplayer mechanics whatsoever, Activision publishing the title. I don't think it's a coincidence that a lot of the design quirks from Tenchu made their way into a game that was otherwise just seen as another Souls title. Design that either wasn't implemented in the previous Souls titles in the same way, or even really at all. Last time you swam in Dark Souls, you died immediately, and last time you used a grapple hook in Bloodborne, you were dreaming. What's interesting to me is that whether Sekiro was intended to be a new Tenchu title or not, it's arguable we ended up getting another Tenchu title in spirit. Most people may not actually remember the series these days, but at least its design isn't completely forgotten. Sekiro is in many ways a Tenchu title that has a modern camera, a dedicated lock-on, doesn't use tank controls, and has a high level of polish that puts it in league with the best of modern games. It's everything the series could never really mash together. They got so much right with those early Tenchu games that it blows my mind, and they're worth remembering because of that. But the few things they got wrong in their exploration of the unknown realm of 3D gameplay, and their inability to find the polish offered by their peers in later titles, have more or less sealed the series' fate. These games are worth trying if you're curious, because they're cool games, if you can suffer through the combat. By contrast, MGS was literally just a souped-up version of Metal Gear 1 and 2 on the MSX. Its controls worked because, similar to Crash Bandicoot, it was more or less just an altered 2D game's control scheme with 3D assets. So while going back to something like MGS is a bit of a clunky experience, it's not frustratingly difficult. It's still more than playable, and games like MGS 2 and 3 still feel great today. Tenchu doesn't. But, you know, maybe Sekiro is good enough. As a fan of Tenchu, it wouldn't have been exactly what I would have wanted from a series revival, but it's still like 90% of what I'd have liked to see. You know, throw in a level editor and make it a little bit more about freeform stealth instead of combat, and that's exactly what I would have wanted. Still, I do hold out hope that one day I can once again play a new game as my old friends Rikimaru, Ayame, and Tetsumaru. But what do you guys think? Have any of you played a Tenchu title? If so, what's your favorite one? What would you like to see out of a Tenchu revival? Sound off in the comments below, and I'll see you next time.